It's open up to the first chapter, the first verse of the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. And we'll start with the blessing we've been saying in lieu of the blessings for the Aliyot to the Torah. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher krishanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe b'midbar Sinai b'ohel moed b'echad lachodesh hasheni b'shana hashenit litzeitam mieretz Mitzrayim lemor se'u et rosh kol adat b'nei Yisrael mishpachotam lebeit avotam b'mispar shemot kol zachar legulgulotam mibein esrim shana v'mala kol yotzei tzava b'Yisrael tifkedu otam Litzivotam atav Yaharon Vitechem yu ish lemate ish rosh levet avotavu Ve'ele shemot anashim asher yamdu itechem Liruvein elitzur ben shteyur Lishimon shlumiel ben Tsurishadai Lihuda Nachshon ben Aminadav Liyisachar Netanel ben Suar Lizvulun Eliav ben Chilon Livnei Yosef Lehephraim Elishama ben Amihud Limnashe Gamliel ben Piratsur Levinyamin Avidan ben Gidoni Lehedan Achiezer ben Amishadai Leasher Pagiel ben Ochran Lehegad Eliasaph ben Duel Lenaftali Achira ben Enan Eile Krue Haida Nesiye Matot Avotam Rashi Alfe Yisrael Heim Vayikach Moshe v'Yaharon et hanashim ha'ela asher nikvu v'shemot v'et kol ha'eda hikehilu b'echad lachodesh hasheni v'yitaldu al mishpachotam leveit avotam b'mispar shemot mibein esrim shana v'mala legulgolotam kasher tziva Adonai et Moshe vayifkedeim b'midbar Sinai. That is the first aliyah of Parshat Bamidbar, which we'll be thinking about and studying throughout the entire week. And now we move to the Amidah for Shabbat afternoon. We're going to do it quietly. It's on page 223 in the Lev Shalem, 234 in the Slim Shalom, 574 in the Sim Shalom. We say this tefillah standing in a quiet whisper. Yaranayo, yaranayo. Yaranayo, yaranayo. Yaranayo, yaranayo. Yaranayo, yaranayo. Hi da da na yo da da na yo. Hi da da na yo da da na yo. Ya da da na yo da da na yo. Ya da 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 da. Hi hi na 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 ya 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 da da na ya. Hi da na na ya ya. Hi da da ya ya ho, ha ba ba ya ya ya, hi da 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 na, hi da da na 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 ya, hi da da ya ya ho, ha na 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 ya ya, hi ya ba 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 ba, ya na 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 ya da da, hi da da ya ya ho. Ya na 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 ya 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 ha da 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 na ya da da na 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 ha da da ya ya ho ha ba ba ya ya da ha ya da da na na. צידך צדק לעולם, בתורתך אמת, בצדקך אלוהים על מרום אשר עשית גדולות אלוהים מחמוך, צדקך כראל, משפטך תהום רבה, אדם ובהמה תושיע אדוני. עלינו, page 231, 248, or 598. עלינו לשבח לאדון, הכל התקו ליוצר בראשית. שלא עשנו גארץ ולא שמנו שמחות האדמה שלא שמחו כנהם עבור עלינו ככל אנחנו קוראים. לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. ונאמר וירא אדוני למלך כל הארץ ביום ההוא ירא אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. Katish Yatom Mourner's Kaddish 232, 249, or 600. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei rabbah v'yalma divra chirutei v'yamlich malchutei v'chayeichon v'yomeichon v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael bagala v'zman kari v'meru amen. Yehei shemei rabbah mavorach leolam leomel maya. Yibarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shemei dekudesha brichu le'elah min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata ta'miran be'alma v'yimru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav hu yaseh shalom Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'meru amen. Again, a Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Welcome, members of the Beth Am community and family. Also, I believe we have friends here from the Ikar community, and I'm guessing, although I don't see what you're seeing. I'm not seeing the same screen you're seeing, so I don't kind of control whom I'm looking at. I think there are extended family members of the Schulweiss family here, but I may not see you or even see the names. So if there are members of the Schulweiss family here, if you can somehow identify yourself so that I can be speaking to you directly, we want to welcome you here as well as you continue to sit Shiva. But I don't see the faces or the names. Are there members of the family here? I'm seeing head nodding yes, but I don't know which screens I'm addressing. Well, welcome. You might be letting me know by raising a hand or something, but I'm not seeing everything. So if you unmute, you can let me know who you are. But for the moment, we're going to do some Torah study. Actually, we're going to do some Haftarah study, a short little break in between Mincha and Mariv.
Not allowing it, controlling it.
Okay, I see the Reich family is trying to unmute, so welcome, and yes, hi. Oop. Our tech folks can permit people to unmute so that we can identify them. Thank you. Oh, okay. We'll get back to that a little bit.
Hello, we're here.
Hi.
Hi.
And who is there? 'Cause I hear you, but I don't see you.
I'm Peter Rich. This is Elisa and Seth Schulweiss.
Oh, Seth's
and
there.
Ethan
Okay.
is here, and a bunch of other relatives.
Okay. Welcome to
So
all of you.
we're here.
Okay, good. Welcome to all of you, and we'll turn to you a little bit later as well. Now, just for a few minutes, because we're actually pretty close to the end of Shabbat, we're going to do some study. Most often at Beth Am on Shabbat afternoon, and in many communities, we take a look at next week's Parsha. And most often that's the Parsha of the Kriyat Torah, the Torah reading. This week, I want us to look not at next week's Torah reading, but at next week's Haftarah. As I mentioned before, these are the first words of Torah and the first words of Haftarah that I ever encountered seriously. This was my bar mitzvah Parsha way back when. And I remember I studied for my bar mitzvah Parsha with my Saba, my father's father, who was a Reform rabbi and a very significant influence in my life. And we studied the Torah reading about the census and what it means to count and how counting is a significant part of expressing love. And we studied the Haftarah, a Haftarah which I only re-encountered later as an adult is in some ways a terrible text. The outcome is lovely, but it's a text of trauma. As the prophet Hosea, speaks about God's dismissing us, accusing us, our ancestors, of harlotry, and then pulling us back in. There's some who believe that what we're seeing in the Haftarah is a beautiful reconciliation between lovers who have gotten far from each other, and there are some who consider God to be a tyrant in Hosea's imagination, and the Israelites to be a battered spouse, and that we're seeing God kind of rope the Israelites back in, but not necessarily in a healthy dynamic. There's some interesting meta discussions there. I want to focus on something micro rather than meta, and that is on the verses from the Haftarah, that if you know any of the verses from the Haftarah without realizing you do, it is these, because the end of the Haftarah of Parshat Bamidbar are the words, Ve'erastich li leolam, I will betroth myself to you forever. I'll betroth myself to you in righteousness and justice and loving kindness. I will betroth myself to you in faithfulness. And you will know God. By weird coincidence, this was not chosen for that reason. The wedding ring that my parents have worn since they were married in the 1960s have Ve'erastich li leolam embedded into it or engraved into it on the inside. It's not that uncommon. It's a very common wedding-themed verse, and that became the last few verses of my Haftarah. Those who are on the Beth Am list received a text sheet. I wish we could share it with those of you who are not in that list, but I have no way of doing that technically now. So I'll teach this material recognizing that many of you do not have the actual words in front of you. If you want to look at the verses themselves, you can open up a Bible to the 2nd chapter of Hosea, verses 21 and 22, or if you're at an Eitz Chaim Chumash, I'll give you the page number. In the Eitz Chaim Chumash, it is page 790 at the bottom. And as members of the Beth Am community know, this is not meant to be a lecture, but a class. So jump on in if there are things you want to ask or say or comment on. I'm not intending just to give oratory here. Okay, so I quoted the verses quickly before. Let's slow it down if we're looking at them. It's the first text on the text sheet, if you have it. Ve'erastich leolam. Let's look at that root. Aras, aleph, resh, sin. It means to betroth. It means to request and receives someone's fidelity, right? Betrothal is the giving and the acquiring of troth. Troth is exclusive, intimate rights. It's fidelity with this person and only this person. It's the beauty and the challenge of marriage, right? The beauty of marriage is that I say I'm yours. The challenge of marriage is that you're the only one for me, right? And we foreclose the notion of a certain kind of closeness with anyone else on the planet once that ring goes on the finger. So Hosea is saying in God's name here, Ve'erastichli, I, God, will betroth you to me. It's a transaction. We'd like to think of a marriage as a romance. There's romance built into it, but it was then and it still is now a transaction. It's a commitment. It's a covenant. It's a promise, right? I am betrothing you to me. I, God, am pulling you, the Jewish people, to me, le'olam, forever. This one's going to last. We'll get back to that in a little bit. And remember that the pretext in the Haftarah is God remembering all the times when the marriage was not working out. So this is a renewing of vows, as it were. Ve'erastichli betzedek uvemishpat uvechesed rachamim. We have two couplets of words. Each of those couplets represents synonyms of one another. God says, I'm going to betroth myself to you, betzedek, justice, uvemishpat, righteousness, those can be interchanged. Bechesed uvrachamim, loving kindness and empathy, those two things can be interchanged. And then the next verse, ve'erastichli be'emunah, I'm going to betroth you to me with a sense of faithfulness. We'll break down that word in a little bit. The root amen is one of the most common used words in Western religion and the most least understood words. Aleph, mem, nun, what does the word actually mean? We translate it as faith, a believability, trust. We'll break down what that might mean. V'yadat et Adonai. And this is translated in several different ways. In some places it's translated as, and you will know God, meaning once I, God, re-betroth you to me, you'll really know what it's like to be in relationship with me. Some people understand the yada here to be the intimate yada, right? In the Bible, yada can not just mean intellectual knowledge, but carnal knowledge. We're going to be in a carnal, flesh-based relationship. And some translate it, I think it's a I don't know, it's not quite a mistranslation, but I'm not sure it's exactly right. Then you shall be devoted to the Lord, as if somehow yodeya can be rendered as a sense of devotion itself. Okay. If those of you who wear tefillin know that when we are binding the tefillin straps around our fingers 3 times, we say each time one of these ve'erastichlis, right? That's ring metaphor, that is bondage metaphor. It's both there, right? The wedding ring, which bonds 2 spouses together, and bondage metaphor, right? We left the shackles of Egypt to be reshackled to God, rebound, and therefore limited in what we can do and whom we can be with. That was the Jewish people's agreement, as it were, at Sinai, which, as we're about to see, failed many times and had to be reinitiated. Okay, the next text on our sheet, which I know not all of you have, is a commentary by the Malbim, Rabbi Meir Leibush Wisser, who was a rabbi in the Kiev area in the 19th century. And he's commenting on the words ve'erastichli. Okay, so I'll read each phrase in Hebrew. You have the translation there in English. I'll translate it phrase by phrase as well, because I know some of you are just experiencing this on an auditory level. Ve'az e'eros otcha. This is now the Malbim imagining what Hosea is saying in God's name. And then in the sense of coming forward, at that point in the future, I will indeed betroth you, mechadash. We're going to start again. We're going to put the past behind us, Israel. It's been rocky since Sinai. You strayed, I got angry. You came back, I embraced you. You sinned, I punished you. We're going to do it all over again. Kamosha Katav, as it is written, and the Malbim quotes the 62nd chapter of the book of Isaiah, verse 5, where it says, and these are words that you'll find familiar because they made it in a lyrical way into Lachadodi, Umasos chatan al kala, just as a groom rejoices over a bride, yasis alayach Elohayach. So will God in the future rejoice over you, meaning at some point in the future we're going to have another chuppah. God will be the groom, you will be the bride, and God will be as happy that day as we imagine the bride and the groom are on their wedding day. That's what's going to happen in the future. Back to the Malbim's words, V'yu erusin chadashim. They're going to be new betrothal. Nivdalim min hakodmim. Different than it's been before. Right? Pledging that we're going to start relating to each other in a way that we had been unsuccessful in the past. Kimo shekatab, he brings another verse from Jeremiah, the 31st chapter, verse 30. V'charati et Beit Yisrael brit chadasha. Jeremiah says, in God's name, I'm going to create, I'm going to craft, I'm going to cut literally with the house of Israel a brit chadasha, a new covenant. Again, a renewal of vows. Ki ha'erosin ha'kodmim, this is back in the Malbim's voice, the earlier betrothal, the earlier terms of our relationship that we've been living through from Sinai until this moment in the 4th or 5th century BCE, maybe 6th century BCE, hayu rak lizman, they were temporary. It's an interesting read. The Malbim is saying that Hosea is saying, that God is saying, Sinai, either it was intended to be only temporary or it turned out to be only temporary, but we're no longer being held by that temporary nature of it. It simply was not going to be a covenant that was going to last. Rak lezman. It was a trial run, as it were. Ki hayu atidim lachto. Because Israel was somehow destined in the future, from Sinai's perspective, to sin. Ulevatel hakesher. And to break the connection, right? We know that the math in our society, 50% of people who stand under the chuppah and say, I do, eventually say, I don't, right? So there is a promise under that canopy where betrothal is offered and transacted and acquired, and then at some point there is sinfulness that passes the boundary of acceptability, and there's bitul hakesher. The relationship breaks down. Happens between people, happened between God and the Jewish people. And so whatever happened at Sinai, which was supposed to be the moment, the triumph, we're going to celebrate it in 9 days, it was rak lezman. It was a temporary covenant, or Israel proved somehow that they had only been interested in a temporary one. Aval az, this is the Malbim continuing, now, lo yechetu od. Somehow they're not going to continue to sin. Velo yivutal hakesher. And the bond will not be obliterated, will not be canceled. Up until now, we have no idea how this is a commentary on the verse. So far, the Malbim seems to be saying that Hosea is calling for renewal of vows. Great, but how is there any indication that what's happening at that moment in Israelite history is going to be a better version than what happened at Sinai? This is the punchline. V'zeh shekara, and this is why the verse continues. This is what it means by the continuation of the line. Ve'erastich li leolam, this time I'm going to betroth myself to you forever. V'zeh yehiyeh al yedei, and this is going to happen how? Not by magic. How is it going to happen? Al yedei, quote, she'erastich li betzedek uv'mishpat. Because I'm going to betroth you to me this time with a sense of justice and a sense of righteousness. The Malbim's trying to make a contention that somehow at Sinai there was a failure. And the failure may have been in both directions. Maybe that they didn't understand what each side was getting into, right? Maybe they didn't know what marriage required of them. The modern marriage therapist, John Gottman, who wrote a wonderful book called Why Marriages Succeed or Fail, contends that most people, when a marriage breaks down, when they're interviewed by people who know something about the institution of marriage, their explanation for why the marriage breaks down seems to be off kilter. And therefore they go into the second marriage with the same kind of perhaps delusions about what relationship is and what relationship isn't. And the studies show that second marriages actually have a higher ratio of divorce than first marriages. John Gottman believes that the primary reason, not the only, the primary reason why relationships break down is because people have no idea what to expect of the other and of themselves in it. Not because they married the wrong person, not because they or the other was a scoundrel, but because they don't know what to expect in that relationship. Here, the Malbim is saying that somehow God is saying, I am committing a little bit more than I was the first time to be betzedek with you, just with you, mishpat with you, to have a sense of righteousness? Does this mean that God's going to have more patience and therefore our waywardness is going to be accepted? Does this mean that God is expecting that from us? It's unclear in the Malbim's commentary. What is clear is that this is what the Malbim thinks is the recipe for an erusin that's going to last. If you turn over the sheet, or on my sheet as it's turned over, you may print it out differently. We have a similar comment, but almost in the other direction. This is the JPS notes from the 1985 edition of the Tanakh. The 1985 edition of the commentary in the Tanakh. The Tanakh hasn't changed. And this is what the JPS says on this verse in that edition. As the bride price, which the bridegroom will pay, he will confer these qualities upon her, so that she will never offend again. It's a really interesting contrast. The Malbim seems to be saying that what's going to make this relationship work this time is God's commitment. I'm going to betroth myself to you in justice and righteousness. That's how we're going to make it forever. And JPS reads it a little bit more, almost, it's hard to put the right word to it, as if God is thrusting or foisting onto the Jewish people a new characteristic, a characteristic of devotion, a characteristic of righteousness, and by God, kind of making you act this way in the relationship, it's going to last. We're going to be able to stay together. One side is I'm changing what I do. The other reading is I'm somehow making it that you change what you do, and some combination of that might give us an opportunity to linger in this relationship for a long time. Let me pause here for 1 second and see if there are questions or comments on any of that, and then I want to do a few more commentaries. Unmute if you'd like to add. I see Marlise, yeah.
Well, I was recognizing Mishpat from the Amida, where it talks about Melech who have Tanakh Mishpat, and it translates that as righteousness with compassion or justice with compassion. So I was wondering, is compassion, is that an accurate translation of the words?
Yeah, so for those in my Rashi class, we discuss this almost every week. Translation is a wonderful and impossible task. It's nearly impossible to render any interesting or even non-interesting ancient Hebrew word into modern English. For the most part, in modern English, we take the couplet of tzedek and mishpat, and it has to do with what is right, what is expected, what is fair. Tzedek tirdof asks us, we believe, to pursue justice. Justice has to do with what is due, what someone is due. And chesed and rachamim have to do with qualities that are more generous, more empathic, more giving of oneself, maybe more than one is due, right? Maimonides, the Rambam, says that the definition of chesed is giving to someone even if they are not due it or more than they are due. So even though sometimes mishpat is translated along the second set of words, mostly we understand tzedek and mishpat to be synonyms each other, words that are appropriate for a courtroom, whereas chesed and rachamim are words that are appropriate for a hug, for a friendship, for a more intimate moment. Larry, Diane, I see your hand up.
Friday afternoon, I'm preparing for next week's Haftorah Plethora. Your email comes in, I said, whoa, this is great. So I'll plug for next week's Haftorah Plethora, which will be about, obviously, this Haftorah. Just a couple of quick things. It was really funny in your Rashi class this week, 3 women talked about the Ve'eres Tichli, a wrapping of the tefillin on the fingers. I thought that was fascinating. You really have diverged away from the text of the chapter and the imagery, which is very interesting, as you said. To my knowledge, I don't know. I may be wrong. I don't think Isaiah is making the same reference of God as a bridegroom. But the interesting relationship that Hosea has, God's the bridegroom, and it's Israel, actually. It's the nation of Israel that is the bride in this particular case, but the people are the bride. Usually God is our father, our king. And the relationship, the hierarchical relationship of a father to children is quite different than the relationship between a husband and a wife, in this case. And the last thing I'm going to say, because I'll say everything else I want to say next week in the Haftarah B'Torah, is I know that it's not the right interpretation, but when I rap and I say the Everest Tichli, I'm thinking very distinctly that it's an erusin, which I'm not sure that it does, maybe comes from the word eros, which is a love, a romantic love. I'm not sure if that's true. I've never heard anyone say that, but I think of it as an engagement, as a betrothal, as a kiddushin between myself and God. And these are the values that I want God to imbue on me. So in that sense, it is very much like what it is that the Malbim was saying, or what the JPS was saying.
Yeah.
Sorry to take so much time.
No, it's great. So many things to respond to. First, the question of whether or not erusin comes from eros is fascinating. I mean, the root aras is a very old biblical root. And I don't know enough about the origin of the Greek root eros to know. If they're not connected, it's a phenomenal coincidence, right? Except by the time that let's assume for the moment that they are associated. I have no idea. By the time it presents itself in the Greek world, it really has to do with the feeling of love, right? And the root aras in Hebrew is not really about the feeling of love. It's simply what you're promising. It's what you're offering, right? Every couple I work with, when we go to a chuppah, I say to them, I want them to know exactly what's happening under the chuppah. The bride and the groom have to have da'at, have to have an understanding of what's happening, and there is a transaction, and that transaction is based on feelings. It might be based on that which the Greeks called eros, but what the transaction is a promise. It's conferring upon yourself the promise to act in a certain way all the time, whether or not you're feeling it, right? And I'm not sure that's what the Greeks meant by eros, but there might be people on the screen who know more about this particular issue than I do, and if so, please pipe up. In terms of the hierarchical versus almost symmetrical relationship we have with God, I would say to that, yes, and then some, right? We have so much imagery, right? It's the king and the subject is different than the bride and the groom, is different than the shepherd and the sheep, right? There's a way in which we project onto the divine the force in whose presence and as a result of whose power we feel infinitesimal and small, and therefore we owe. There's the presence of comfort that we so rarely feel from the world, and therefore we project it onto God so we can have that. And there's a mutuality. And the Kabbalah expands upon that mutuality. Those of you know a little bit about the Sfirot, these emanations of God's presence. The bottom rung of the Kabbalah is Shekhinah. It's also sometimes, it's most often called Shekhinah. So Shekhinah is often translated as the feminine presence of God. It's also called Knesset Yisrael, the feminine gathering of the Jewish people. So Shekhinah is both God's lowest rung and our highest rung. So if we kadosh, 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 enough onto our tippy toes, we enter into the realm down to which God has allowed God's self to descend, and there we meet. So when we're meeting there, are we still the subject and God as our king? Are we the sheep and God as our shepherd, or are we in a union temporarily, right? Those who did my meditation last week know that last week, the week of the Omer, this is actually the end of that week, was Yesod. Yesod, according to the Kabbalah, is the level in the Omer of bonding, a foundational bonding where you go past mutuality to unity. Most of our connections with other people, at best, are mutual, right? We're both getting something that we need. Yesod is beyond mutuality to unity, where for an instant, for a micro instant, right, as Buber might say, in the I-thou moment, that once you notice you're in it, it's over. It's not that you're getting something and the other is getting something. You're one. It's hard to stretch our minds that way, right? A moment in tefillah where it's not that I'm praying to God and God is listening or God is responding, but I know this sounds almost sacrilegious. It's I, God, together. I'm not saying that I am God, but in that moment of ecstatic prayer or quiet prayer, there's a unity an indivisibility. That's what we're trying to get to in Yesod, and that's what I think the Kabbalah is imagining at that level, and that is partly what's happening in a bridegroom image, except that, and this is uncomfortable to say but important to say, in the ancient world, it wasn't a mutual relationship, right? It was not, the groom's relationship to the bride was not the same as the bride's relationship to the groom, either with respect to fidelity, what was offered, right? The reason why there was only one ring at an ancient Jewish wedding ceremony is that the bride was giving troth to the husband and being betrothed. The groom was not giving troth to the bride because he could theoretically marry other women. He was not being betrothed, right? And certainly they were not in an equal position financially in terms of power. Our modern image of relationship grafted backwards onto this moment suggests that what's happening between God and the Jewish people is a mutuality. There's probably a very significant power game being played out here as well. Anything else, Tybal?
When you started, the way I heard this, I'm not saying it's correct, but that you were saying that this text, this Haftorah, bound you in a certain way, that it was the first serious engagement and it was done in the context of a family relationship with your grandfather, who was also a rabbi. So that's a complicated, in a good way, relationship. And I'm just wondering if this is one of the texts that has bound you for longest, how you've heard that, it might speak to you differently, or you focus on it differently in different phases of your life, particularly at the point where you yourself became a rabbi, you yourself can't be entered in a covenantal relationship with another human being.
Thank you for that comment, Tybal, for kind of mirroring that back to me. I was not even aware of those associations. I was making them. And thank you, everyone, for being here for my therapy session. I'm really appreciating what I'm able to share with everyone. That's really interesting to think about. It's not necessarily the verses that I've thought about most in my life, but yes, these are the first verses of the tradition that I encountered seriously. And when I teach them, even and especially in this moment, I do feel my Saba with me on a level even more profound than always. There's a piece of him that's always with me because I learned so much about what it means to be a husband and a friend and a rabbi and a human being from him, and I miss him terribly. But I specifically remember the conversations we had over these verses and the gentleness of his voice. So it's interesting for you to mirror back that these verses about being bound emerge from a very bonded relationship that I have with him, and hope in some ways that I still have with him across space and time. Thank you for that, Tybal. We're getting close to the end of Shabbat, and by which I mean we're basically at the end of Shabbat. So what you have on the rest of the source sheet, which I encourage you to look at later on, are a couple of comments, including some verses from Isaiah that get into what the root Aleph, Mem, Nun might mean. The crib notes is that we understand it to mean faith or believability, but Radak, a French commentator from the Middle Ages, quoting Isaiah, suggests that that root might have to deal with steadfastness or eternity or things that will last, and the linkage between the first part of the shiur and the second part of the shiur, had we done both parts, would have been that even if the Hosea model is emerging from a context of an unhealthy and imbalanced relationship, I do think that the wisdom that emerges is that if we want to get to a relationship of emunah, not only of faithfulness, but of endurance, then what we owe to it is tzedek and mishpat and chesed and rachamim, and we owe the relationship to expect it more of ourselves than we expect it of the other. And that has a chance of making those nuptials last a very long time, whether it's an actual marriage or a friendship or a relationship between a rabbi and a community or any other relationship of meaning that we want to last. So let's move aside, because I want to not force you to linger any longer than we need to end on this evening. We're going to go to Kaddish de Rabbanan, and then we'll go to Marif. Hold on. I'm going to get the page number. Excuse me 1 second. Okay, if you're in the Lev Shalem, it's page 111, Slim Shalom 71, Sim Shalom 20, Kaddish Rabbanan. It can be recited by the mourners. It can also be recited to anyone who felt they just participated in interesting Torah study. Yitgadal, Yitgadash, Shemei Rabbah, V'alma divrach chirutei, v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon uvyomechon, uv'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, b'agala uv'izman kari v'meru amen, yehei shemei Rabbah mevorach, leolam leomei almaya, yitbarach v'yishtabach, v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnasei, v'yithadar v'yitalev v'yithalal, shmei kudasha brichu, Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechamata, damiran be'alma v'maru amen. Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Tamidehon v'al kol Tamidei Tamidehon v'al kol man da'askin be'oraita diva atra hadain v'diva chol atar v'atar Yehei lahon ulchon shlama rabba China v'chista v'rachamin v'chayin arichin umzona revicha ufor kanamin kodam avohon di v'shmaya v'maru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chaim tovim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mramav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. We'll go into Mariv 264 in the Lev Shalem, 281 in the Slim Shalom, 200 in the Sim Shalom. Vehu rachum yechaper von v'lo yashchid, v'her ba'ala shiva po v'lo yirkol chamato, Adonai Hoshia, hamelech ya'anenu v'yom koreinu, baruch atah l'mchom asher bararanu. El chai v'kayam tamidim lo chaleinu le'olam be'ed baruch atah Adonai ha'ma'ari v'aravi mahavat olam beit Yisrael machad. Ki im chayenu v'yorach yameinu v'hem negei yomam v'layla v'yavatecha al tasir memenu le'olamim baruch atah Adonai ohev amo Yisrael el melech ne'eman. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Ani Adonai Elohechem asher tzeitti etchem eretz Mitzrayim liot lechem le'Elohim ani Adonai Elohechem emet v'emunah kazot v'kayam aleinu ki hu Adonai. Umalchuto bratzon kiblu alehem Moshe b'nei Yisrael lachanu shira b'simcha rabba v'yamru chulam mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai mi kamocha nadar b'kodesh norati lo tosei fele malchutecha ra'u banecha bokei hayam lifnei Moshe ze eli anu v'yamru Adonai imloch leolam va'ed v'nemar kifad Adonai et Yaakov ugalo miyad chazak mimenu baruch ata Adonai ga'al Yisrael Hashkiveinu Adonai Eloheinu l'shalom amidim l'olam. Ushmor tzeitenu uvoveinu l'chaim l'shalom yatav olam baruch ata Adonai shomer amo Yisrael la'ad baruch Adonai le'olam amen v'amen baruch Adonai b'tzion. כי המלכות שלך היא ליום מעט ימלוך בכבוד, כי אין לנו מלך אלא אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני המלך בכבודו תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד, ועל כל מעשיו. The Amidah said in a whisper, beginning on 270 in the Lev Shalom, 286 in the Slim Shalom, 210 in the Sim Shalom. Make sure to add in the paragraph at the end of Shabbat. And also just a point of clarification, if it was confusing for some, the Beth Am standard throughout the pandemic is that we've considered these digital gatherings to be a minyan for the purposes of saying Kaddish, but only Mourner's Kaddish. And for the rest of the davening, we're considering it to be a group of individuals davening at the same time, but that's why we omitted other things that require a minyan. The Amidah said quietly, even with a minyan, again, page 270, 286, or 210. If you're still davening, please continue at your own pace. We continue in the middle of the Lev Shalem with Vihinoam on 279. I don't have those page numbers in the other Sidurim, but this should be an indication of what page it is at the end of the Amidah. Vihinoam Adonai Eloheinu Aleinu Ma'aseh Yedenu Kona Aleinu Ma'aseh Yedenu Kona Yoshe B'Seder Yom Etzel Shaddai Yilo Nana Marlam. יקראני ועיניהו עמו אנוכי בצער אכלצהו ויכבדהו אורך ימים משביעהו ובשועתי אורך ימים משביעהו והרעהו בשועתי. Back to 216 in the Lev Shalem. ואתה הקדוש יושב של כל הקדוש קדוש קדוש. ותישאני רוח בשמה אחרי כל רעש גדול ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו לעד רוח. אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. למען לא ניגע לריק, למען לא ניגע לריק ולא נלד לה בהלה. ויבטחו בך ידי שמך כי לא עזבת דורשך אדוני אדוני חפץ למען צדקו יגדיל תורה ויאדיר. We'll pause to count the Omer. It's on 63 in the Lev Shalem. I'm sorry, I don't have the page number in the other Sidurim. We'll start by singing this beautiful Nigun composed by Yosef Goldman and Shir Yaakov Fait to the meditation that we do before Sfirat Omer, and then we'll count the night of the Omer. Leshem yichud Kudsha brichu ushechintei Hineni muchan umezuman Lekayem mitzvat tasei Shel Sfirat HaOmer Shel Sfirat HaOmer Shel Sfirat HaOmer Shel Sfirat HaOmer Leshem Yichud Kudsha brichu ushechintei Hineni muchan umezuman Lekayem mitzvat tasei Shel Sfirat HaOmer Shel Sfirat HaOmer Shel Sfirat HaOmer Shel Sfirat HaOmer Shvartem Lachem Mimocharat HaShabbat HaMiyom Aviachem Et Omer Tenuah Sheva Shabbatot Meotiyena Ad Mimacharat HaShabbat HaShvi'it Yisbru Chamishim Yom. Yesterday was the 41st day of the Omer. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kiddushanu B'mitzvotav V'tzivanu Al Sfirat HaOmer Hayom Shnayim V'Arbayim Yom Shehem Shisha Shavuot LaOmer. Today are 42 days, which are 6 weeks of the Omer. Aleinu 281 or 297 or 696. Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol latekru la liyoser breshit shelo asanogi hartlov samanu kim shvod adon shlam chalkenehem agor aleinu kechol hamanachnu korim lifnei melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu Hashem. Akenaka velachad and Elohim hey Rabbi heard zecha letakin lamachu jadai. Kakatu b'Toratech Adonai imloch leolam v'ed b'nemar b'haya Adonai l'melech al kol haaretz bayom hahu yeh Adonai echad ushemo echad. Kadisha Tom Mourner's Kaddish 282 298 or 698. Seth and family, do you want to unmute and lead us in the Mourner's Kaddish?
Yep, you're unmuted.
Amen. 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 And I want to ask you to be seated, and the others on the Zoom, if you'd like, you can rise, because if we were in an actual Shiva Minyan, we'd come around the grieving family, and we would make a circle with our bodies and our very presences to try to offer a sense of comfort and connection during a time of loss. So I think posture matters. So if you want to rise and turn all of your attention to the members of the Schulweis family who are in these early days of grief, mourning Malka, and in a very profound and sad way, the end of an era for this family, an end of an era for this Jewish community, the extent to which your family has been so significant in the arc of the LA Jewish community. And we wish we could be with you. We wish we could be extending our hands to you and our hugs to you. We do extend these words to you that our community have been using for thousands of years to help those in mourning feel a little bit less alone. Hamakom yinachem etchem betoch sha'ar avelei Tzion v'Yerushalayim. May the Holy One who is everywhere offer you comfort amongst all the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. Yehi zichra baruch. May her memory be a blessing. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to do Havdalah so we can end Shabbat, and then we can keep the Zoom open so members of the friends and family of the Schulweises can linger and do what we would have done in a normal situation, which is to continue talking. As soon as I do Havdalah, I unfortunately going to have to run out because I'm leading a program out on our field. But let's do Havdalah together, and then we can keep this Zoom open as long as you like. Excuse me 1 second. Let me just get this stuff. The only problem with Havdalah in this room is that the air conditioning is going so hard right now that I hope that the match will stay lit long enough for me to actually light this candle. Let's see how it goes. Anay, 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 anay. Anay, 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 0 for 2. Anay, 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 ay, anay, 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 ay, ay, anay, anay, ay, 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 anay, 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 ay, anay, ay, 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 anay, 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 ay, anay, anay, ay. This is now an anti-Havdalah candle. There's one wick lit. It's like the opposite of what it's supposed to be. Of course, it's a new Havdalah candle, so there's a lot of wax on the other wicks. Let's see what I can do. They teach you this in year 3 of rabbinical school, maybe in Ziegler year 2, but JTS is year 3. Come on, come on, come on. All right, if I can't get the rest of it lit, then I'm going to have to ask someone else to say that one of the brachot. Hinei el Yeshua hati.
Want to try this one?
Eftach velo efchad, ki aziv ezimrad Yah, Adonai vayehili Yeshua, ushaftamayim besason, mimayne Yeshua, Ladonai Yeshua, alamcha berchatecha sela, Adonai tzvaot imanu, miskav lanu, Elohei Yaakov sela, Adonai tzvaot, ashrei adam boteach bach, Adonai Yoshia, hamelech yaneinu v'yom koreinu, la Yehudim. Hai ta'ora, besimcha besason v'yakar, kein ti'eh lanu, kos Yeshuot esa, uv'shem Adonai ekra, Adonai, 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 Baruch atah Adonai Macholam borei pri agafen, Baruch atah Adonai Macholam borei minei besamim. Baruch Ata Adonai Mecholam Borei Miorei Ha'esh. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Mecholam Magdil Ben Kodesh Ben Elchoshech Ben Yisrael Amim Ben Yom HaShvi L'Sheshem Mei Hamaseh. Baruch Ata Adonai HaMavdil Ben Kodesh L'Cho. Hamavdil ben kodesh lecho, chatoteinu yimcho, zareinu v'chaspeinu yarbe yarbekacho, v'kahakochavim balayla. Zareinu v'chaspeinu yarbe yarbekacho, v'kahakochavim balayla. Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hagiladi, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hagiladi. B'mehira yavo elinu, Mashiach ben David. B'mehira yavo elinu, Mashiach ben David. Wish everyone a Yeshua Tov, a good vach. Stay on the Zoom and linger and give a sense of comfort and presence to the Shulweiss family. They'll continue Sit Shiva tomorrow night at the same Temple Beth Am Daily Minyan Zoom link. And we wish everyone a week of health and peace, and go get vaccinated. Shavua Tov, everyone.
Wait, what is it?
In the morning.
No, it said 8 last time.
Oh, tomorrow's 8.
Yeah, Sunday is 8.
Hi, Elisa and Peter.
Hello.